Hi, this is Tyson, and we're looking at some very basic building blocks of JavaScript and how you can build on these things to create, fully functioning apps eventually. And so, in our last video, we looked at how we could combine. We could use variables, and we can use some of the basic primitive types in JavaScript. But now we're going to be looking at functions. And so this is a basic named function in JavaScript. It's just you use the function keyword, and then you can call it by using the same function name again. So if we look at our console, it says "Hello World" because we've declared our function right here. This is the function declaration, and then we just call it right here by just using the function name and then the parameter or the yeah. And so we console log hello world, and of course we could call this over and over again. It's reusable now because it's just a small chunk of code. So now when you see it twice here again, because we called it twice, or we could never call it. Like a function could just sit there and never actually be called. It's just something that you can either call or not call, and it's just a small modular piece of code that you can work with. So going back to our slide, we have the this. This is kind of a big thing in JavaScript because this can kind of be confusing for a lot of people because this is the context of the function, and so it's a lot like in a lot of languages you'll have classes, but JavaScript didn't actually have classes until kind of recently. And so you had what's called a prototypical inheritance, which builds kind of a class-like inheritance, but instead of using classes, you're using functions to inherit from each other by inheriting their functional prototype. So the this context can be kind of confusing when you start getting into all of that. But here, this is kind of a very simplified version of it, but we have the this.message, and so when we call the function getMessage, it's just going to return this.message, which is defined right here. But you have to remember that outside of the scope of your function, like if we take it out here, this.message is not going to exist. It's going to be undefined because now this is actually referring to the window if you're in the browser. And so, or if you're like in Node or something, this is the global state. So it's really dependent on where you are. Another thing to remember, so if we say this dot message equals hi right here, of course when we log that out it's going to say hi. But if we go down here after we've called this dot message and we console.log this dot message, this will be the second thing that shows up. You see hi has been overwritten by this dot message right here. And so it can be kind of confusing, like what this is in a certain context, and I'll kind of show you why it's confusing here in a second, because you can actually change what this is by doing things like bind. So bind actually completely changes the context of your this. So here we have this function called getMessage, but we're actually creating another function called getMessageBound, which is what we're going to be calling here. And getMessageBound calls getMessage.bind, and .bind actually changes the context of the message. So you can see here that it's undefined. But if I change this to message is 123, this is going to log 123 because this dot message in this case, since it's bound to this object that I'm passing into it, is actually going to change. It's gonna make this dot message be completely different. It's not going to be what you would expect it to be. Hello world. And there are two other ways you can actually change the context of your this. Another one is call. So here, this is very similar to bind, but instead of creating a new function, you're actually just calling the function that already exists. So here we're calling get message, but the first parameter you pass into call is actually the context, and then the second parameter and all the parameters after that are the properties on the function itself. So we're passing in Oompa is the company. That's the company I work at, and then the context right here becomes this. So you see hi Oompa because that's the context dot message plus the company. The last way you can change this on a function is by calling apply. And apply is pretty much exactly the same as call, except instead of passing in a list of all of your properties that your function is going to be able to call, we're passing in an array. And this can be handy if you're like programmatically building up what you're passing into your function. So if you need to create a function call kind of dynamically, then it can be pretty nice to be able to call it as an array as opposed to just a bunch of properties. All right, so next we have arrow functions. This is kind of what I lean towards because it's really easy to reason about. You see here we have we're creating a const, which you will remember from the last video, and we have this const called scope example. And now we're taking a property we're passing into the function, the message, and so we're just saying hello world, passing that in, and it's logging it out. And this is really easy to reason about. You never see. It's also a very it's more concise because you don't, instead of saying function, you just have this arrow function right here, and you can actually, if you don't have anything other than the function return, you can actually just do this, take off the curly braces, and and whatever is at the right after the arrow function is what gets returned. So you can actually make some really concise looking like one-liners. And so this is kind of a newer like ES6 way of handling functions, but it's really convenient sometimes. And I tend to veer towards this just because it's just a more functional kind of approach to writing functions. So next of all, we have passing in parameters. We've kind of seen a little bit of this already just by looking at some other examples. But you see here, I'm passing in this object with the message hello world, and so I've got this options dot message. So you can pass in anything into a function. You can pass in objects or strings or numbers or whatever, and you can access them by whatever callbacks you need to. So like here we're passing in options, but let's say we wanted to add another parameter called year. So we'll pass in 2017, and then we can say it is year. And so now it says hello world, it is 2017. Because we've passed in those parameters, and then we've referenced them on our console.log. So the last thing I wanted to talk about here is that you can actually pass in callbacks. Because of the dynamic nature of JavaScript, you can actually pass functions into functions that the function can call, which I know that's like mind-blowing when you first start thinking about it gets into kind of like a weird pattern sometimes because of the way you can use it, but it's really useful especially for asynchronous stuff. So here we're just we have this function called passing callbacks. I pass in a callback and then I call it back with hello. But let's say we wanted to actually call this after a certain amount of time. So we'll do a set timeout, and we'll say after 5 seconds, we're going to trigger this callback here. So wait, and it'll come in a second. And there it is. We had hello after 5 seconds. And so you can use these callbacks to, do. This is before we had like promises and a lot of like our more advanced asynchronous flows in JavaScript. Like callbacks were the way to go. Like you could actually do anything asynchronous just by passing callbacks and then calling them whenever you needed to. And this is still a pattern you'll see a lot. So it's something to be aware of because you sometimes will have libraries and stuff that actually use callbacks, and so you'll get a callback and then you'll need to call it at some point after some given thing. And so this is definitely, even though this isn't like typically the way to go anymore, it's still really cool and interesting the way that it can work. So next of all, we're going to be talking about objects. So I'll get into that in the next episode, but I just thought this would be a good start on how functions work and kind of the very most basic things about functions in JavaScript.